Athens, 432 years before Christ. The woman stands barefoot in the agora, not as a citizen but as a warning. Her hair has been hacked short not by a barber but by her husband's own hand. A red wool rope binds her wrists, and a crowd forms around her like flies to spilled wine. She has not been tried, nor heard, nor spared. Her husband whispered the word moicheia to the magistrate, and that alone was enough. Now she is stripped of her veil, her name, and her future. What happens next is not punishment, it is ritual humiliation performed by the state. She does not scream as the first olive hits her chest, nor when the children begin to chant. Her eyes are fixed ahead, not in defiance, but in absence. Women have been here before her, others will follow. But this moment is hers alone, and it will not be forgotten, not by those who watched, and not by those who lived long enough to see their own daughters brought to this same place. Her name will be erased from the family records, her children declared illegitimate, her dowry returned to the house that gave her away. The philosopher in the crowd will call this justice, the priest will call it divine order, the merchant will call it necessary. But the woman, whose knees now buckle beneath her, calls it nothing. She has no words left, only breath, only skin, only shame. Moicheia. The word echoes across centuries, mistranslated as mere adultery, but in Athens it meant the unraveling of a city's sacred threads. A woman accused of this crime threatened not just marriage but inheritance, lineage, and the illusion of male control. She became a breach in the wall, and Greek law knew only one way to seal breaches: with spectacle. This is where we begin, not with verdicts but with rope, not with proof but with accusation. In a city that prided itself on reason and debate, the most intimate accusation required neither, only a husband's word, only a whisper. From there, the machinery of shame moved swiftly. The crowd did not need convincing, they needed entertainment. And the law, written in cool marble and warm blood, gave them exactly what they wanted. This was not the worst punishment a Greek woman could face, not by far, but it was the first the moment the accusation left his mouth and lodged itself in her body. A sentence without trial, a scar without wound, a ritual that said, "You were his, and now you are nothing." In Athens, moicheia was not simply adultery. It was an offense so severe it was etched into the very foundation of the city's laws, a crime that struck at the roots of lineage, inheritance, and the sanctity of male ownership. The word itself held a weight that went beyond betrayal. It meant that a woman had been penetrated by someone other than her husband, that her womb had been contaminated, that the future of the household was now in question. A wife's fidelity was not a private matter between lovers. It was a public issue with legal consequences, civic consequences, and consequences for the survival of the polis itself. The moment a woman was suspected of straying, she became an enemy not just of her husband, but of the entire male order. And in ancient Athens, enemies were to be neutralized, not reasoned with. The law did not require proof. A man did not need witnesses or confessions. He simply had to accuse. If he caught another man with his wife in the act, he could kill him on the spot without penalty. The law encouraged it, in fact, framing it as an act of justice, a restoration of the sacred balance. The woman, however, could not be killed outright. Her body was too valuable to discard immediately. Instead, it would be repurposed, first through humiliation, then through exile, and for many, through prostitution. A married woman found guilty of moicheia could be sold into slavery or forced into state-sanctioned brothels, where her body would no longer belong to one man, but to every man who could pay a few drachmas. It was not considered punishment, but purification. By being used, again and again, her previous sin would be burned out of her like infection from a wound. What made Greek law particularly cruel was its civility. There were no screaming mobs dragging women into the streets, at least not always. There were procedures, contracts, legal speeches crafted by men who would become legends of philosophy and democracy. And yet those same men, Demosthenes, Lysias, Aeschines, argued for the complete exclusion of adulterous women from religious rites, from public life, from their own children's futures. A wife once accused could not touch holy water. could not attend weddings or funerals, could not walk unveiled without risking arrest. She was not just punished, she was erased, her presence declared pollution. Greek law treated the female body as both sacred and dangerous. It must be protected, owned, enclosed. But once that enclosure had been breached, even by rumor, the woman became untouchable in the most literal sense. She was a contaminated object, neither living nor dead in the eyes of the law, a creature without rights, a memory others pretended never existed. And yet her punishment endured in every whispered warning passed from mother to daughter, in every sideways glance at the market, in every lock that clicked behind her at night. Moicheia was not just a law, it was a sentence the city kept writing into the flesh of its women. There was no single punishment for moicheia that would have been too merciful. Instead, there was a spectrum of degradation, each step designed to deepen the humiliation, to extend the punishment beyond the moment and into memory. The law gave husbands options, and the cruelest part was that cruelty was a choice legal, celebrated, and often applauded. A man could choose to sell his wife to a brothel, and it would be considered justice. He could force her to parade half-naked through the agora with her shaved head glistening under the sun, and it would be seen as moral instruction. He could imprison her in her own home for the rest of her life, and the courts would call it restraint. In a city famed for its debates and logic, moicheia required no defense, no nuance. A woman accused was already condemned. Some were led through the streets in silence, their heads bowed, their robes torn. Others were marked, literally burned with iron or branded with words no longer legible to us, but unmistakable in meaning. There are ancient vase paintings that depict women crouched in fear, their arms covering their faces while men gesture above them with rods and blades. The artists did not label them as criminals. They did not need to. The posture said everything. This was a woman who had overstepped. This was a woman being returned to her place. And then there was the radish, a punishment so specific, so theatrical, it could only have come from a society obsessed with form and symbolism. If a man caught his wife in the act, he could legally subject her lover to a public act of violation. A large radish would be forced into the accused man's body as a ritual emasculation. But the woman, though spared the radish, would not escape unscathed. She would be displayed as the reason for the disgrace. She would be named in court records, denounced in front of neighbors, and watched for the rest of her life, as though her very breath threatened to destabilize the household. The punishment was less about pain and more about permanence. Greek drama loved to speak of fate, of destiny written in the stars. But for women, destiny was written in silence, in obedience, in the invisible line that divided honor from ruin. The moment that line was crossed, voluntarily or not, there was no path back. Some families disowned their daughters, others locked them in rooms and told the neighbors they had died. A few sent them to rural brothels where no one would recognize their faces, and some did worse, left them in temples as offerings, not to the gods, but to public scorn. These women became warnings, not because they had committed crimes, but because someone had said they did. In Athens, the punishment did not begin with guilt. It began with suspicion, and it never ended. The law never had to lift the blade. It simply handed it to the husband and turned its gaze away. Under Athenian custom, a man had full authority to punish his wife for moicheia in whatever way he saw fit, so long as her blood did not stain the altar of the gods. If he chose to kill her lover, he was justified. If he chose to disfigure her, the city turned its head. Justice, in Athens, was measured not in fairness, but in the restoration of male control. And when control was lost, the body became the battlefield where order was reimposed. Mutilation was not considered barbaric, it was philosophical. The beauty of a woman was seen as her most dangerous power, her eyes, her mouth, her voice, her scent. They were all threats to the civic body if left untamed. So husbands did not simply beat their wives, they marked them, they cut off hair, ears, lips, they branded symbols onto foreheads. The goal was not pain, it was permanence. A face could be turned into a sentence, a warning, a scarred proclamation of guilt that spoke louder than any court decree, and it was legal. The laws of Solon, The speeches of Demosthenes, the silence of juries, they all gave permission without ever needing to speak the word. In one case, a husband sliced the corners of his wife's mouth from cheek to cheek, forcing her to wear a smile she no longer felt. In another, a woman was gagged with woven reeds and left in the temple of Artemis, tied to the columns, while passers-by whispered prayers and warnings to their daughters. These acts were not seen as excesses. They were seen as necessary. When the state feared instability, it did not challenge men. It disciplined women. What made these punishments more cruel was the poetry used to defend them. Philosophers argued that a woman's virtue lived in her silence, her stillness, her loyalty. If she moved beyond the walls of her oikos, if she laughed too easily at another man's joke, if her dress fluttered too freely in the marketplace, she was opening the door to chaos. The husband, then, was the gatekeeper of morality, and if he failed to control her, it was his duty to correct the error through blade, through rope, through exile. Punishment became inheritance. A woman who had once been accused could not marry again, could not return to her father's house, could not bear children who would be accepted into the citizen rolls. Her body became a closed ledger, no longer worthy of names, of titles, of continuation, and yet her suffering was paraded as proof of justice. The man who had disfigured her would be praised for his restraint after all. He had let her live. But in Athens, to live without dignity, without temple, without name, was worse than death, and they all knew it. She survived, but survival was not mercy. In Athens, a woman who lived through the punishment of moicheia did not return to her life. She stepped into a different kind of death, one without a grave. The law did not need to kill her. It simply made her untouchable. She could no longer enter the sacred spaces of the city. The temples of Demeter and Athena, once open to her during festivals, prayers, and childbirth rites, were now forbidden. Even the water drawn from the public fountains was considered tainted if touched by her hand. She became a living curse. Her name was removed from the household registry. Her children, if she had any, might be disinherited. A stain clung to them, silent but permanent. Neighbors stopped speaking to her. Her former friends crossed to the other side of the street. Market vendors refused her coins. The seamstresses who once embroidered her himation with delicate patterns now whispered behind closed doors, folding fabric meant for other women. This isolation was not written into the law. It was deeper. It was cultural, communal, complete. Some women fled the city, hoping a new polis would offer them anonymity, but news traveled faster than they could. Their faces were remembered. Their shame was retold. Others were confined to the back rooms of their family homes, seen only by servants and the very old, and some were sent to the state-run brothels, a punishment disguised as economic utility. There, a woman might live another 10 or 20 years, but not as herself. She became an object, a lesson, a warning. For the price of a single coin, any man could take from her what had once belonged only to her husband, and in doing so, the city believed balance had been restored. Records from Athenian law courts show that even women proven innocent, those who had survived the ordeal of false accusation, rarely returned to their former status. Suspicion left a deeper wound than guilt. The philosopher might argue that justice had been done, but no one invited her to weddings, no one trusted her with children. No one believed her completely. In a society obsessed with purity, even a cleared name still carried dust. For those who did survive, silence became the only weapon left. Mothers warned their daughters not to speak too loudly, not to laugh too often, not to be alone too long. Women learned to make their presence small, their voices soft, their footsteps quiet. To be noticed was to be vulnerable, to be remembered was to be at risk. The city trained them to be invisible. And so the punishment lived on not just in the woman who had been accused, but in every woman who saw her, who remembered her, who feared becoming her. In Athens, a woman's survival after moicheia was not freedom. It was a slow, continuous erasure, one that the law never had to write, because the people enforced it with their silence. She no longer walks among the crowd. Her name is not carved on any stone. Her story was never recorded by poets, never argued in the assembly, never remembered by lawgivers. But she was there on the stone steps of the temple, on the dusty edge of the agora, inside the shuttered rooms where whispers did more damage than daggers. She was there the moment her husband accused her, and in Athens, that moment was enough to destroy a life, not through fire, not through rope, but through silence, exile, and ritual humiliation passed off as law. The philosophers of the city wrote volumes on justice, but they had no words for her. The tragedians performed stories of gods and kings, but not of the woman locked in her father's cellar because her husband changed his mind. The orators debated the morality of war, but not the morality of branding a woman's cheek because she laughed at the wrong man's joke. They saw her punishment not as excess, but as balance, not as cruelty, but as order. In their eyes, she was not a person, she was a threat. And threats, in Athens, were dealt with quickly. Greek law was a mirror, one that reflected the fears of men and forced those fears onto the bodies of women. Every rule about moicheia was written not to protect marriage, but to protect male pride. It was not the betrayal that hurt them. It was the idea that something they claimed as theirs might have been touched by another, and so they punished. Not to restore what was lost, but to ensure no one else dared take what they believed they owned. The woman's body became evidence. Her suffering became proof. Her erasure became precedent. Even now, thousands of years later, the echo remains, in the way societies blame women for the betrayal of men, in the way accusations spread faster than facts, in the way honor is still tied to silence. The Athenian woman punished for moicheia lives on, not in the history books, but in the fear that still lingers in women's voices when they speak too boldly, in their glances over the shoulder, in the warnings passed from mother to daughter about how to survive in a world that has always punished them for being seen. She was never meant to be remembered, but you remember her now. If you believe stories like hers still matter, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. I read them all.